Good morning, I'm Chris Fox, and today we're talking about world building. Specifically, how I built the Umbral Depths and why I built them the way that I built them. So before we jump into that segment, I want to talk for a minute about the importance of travel and communication in your world building. So these are two things that many new world builders sort of overlook or don't think too much about, and they really can influence what type of story is possible. So to give you an example, Lord of the Rings is about a small group of people basically walking 300 or 400 miles through tough country. There's a funny video on the internet called The Lord of the Rings in 5 Minutes, and the premise is basically, what if Frodo and Gandalf had gotten on an eagle, flown up over Mount Doom, and just dropped the ring in? Ploop! All of a sudden, you have no story. It's possible in that instance for travel to fix a problem that they've got. So they need to get rid of this ring, they've got to get it to Mount Doom. If you could simply fly it over, in orbit and drop it into this volcano, then you don't really have a story. And so you can see that this story is very dependent on the type of travel that is allowed or available. And the same holds true for communication. So I think most of you have probably watched Game of Thrones. The only way in Game of Thrones for people to learn new information is for a raven or a writer. So a raven shows up at your castle maybe 2 or 3 weeks after the fact, and it will tell you whatever the big news events are. And that's the only way for you to find out. If you're all the way up in the north, you don't necessarily know what's going on down at Queen's Landing. And so this communication can really restrain and change the type of stories that are possible. How would Game of Thrones be different if every one of those characters had a Facebook account and a smartphone? If information could get everywhere quickly, certain people would not have died. Other people may have died sooner. Wars would have been completely different. So really, this setting is grounded in travel and communication. Those are very much influencing what type of story is possible. So we'll go ahead and we'll jump into the Umbral Depths now. I'm going to show you the decisions that I made about how and why travel and communication work like they do in my universe, and you'll sort of see how that allows me to tell the story that I want to. So without further ado, let's jump into that section and see the Umbral Depths. Okay, so as I alluded to in the first part of the video, travel and communication are very important to the fabric of your universe and determine kind of the rules under which your story problems can exist. So in the Magitech Chronicles, I've got about a 30 light year span with maybe 20 or 30 systems in it. And this graphic, which I pulled off of Google, shows 21 real worlds within 12 light years of Earth. So mine is probably 3 times the size of this, but this can give you, sort of a visual reference point until I can make my own of what a sector of the galaxy looks like. What that means is to travel from one end of my sector to the other will probably take a normal ship about, let's say, 3 years. I'm allowing technology to have FTL drives. Those FTL drives can go about 10 times the speed of light. So if you want to go from planet 5 to planet 13, you can zip through space, and eventually, after months or years of travel, you'll get there. You can see that sort of frames my universe and tells you what's possible and how space exploration works. But then you have to beg the question, well, since there's magic in the Magitech Chronicles, does magic break the rules? And of course they do. I have decided that magic will allow you to travel far more quickly than normal FTL drives, but with risks, of course. And in deciding how to do this, I had to ask myself some tough questions, like what was I going to create that would allow me just to travel from one place to the other? Should they just be able to teleport? And I didn't really like that. I wanted something with a little bit more flair, and so I decided that I was going to use another plane of existence. And this has been done in many different intellectual properties. In this case, we're looking at the Immaterium, which belongs to Warhammer 40K. They have something also known as the Warp. I'll click this so you can see the image, where it's this crazy dimension where time and space run wild. There are demons and dark gods and all sorts of crazy things in the Warp. But for anybody who's willing to brave the warp, they can travel far more quickly, reaching their destination in a fraction of the time. So I decided, okay, I want to do something that's going to be like the warp. I want to have my own sort of astral plane of existence that will shorten travel, but what is that going to look like? Now, I didn't want to use the warp or anything like the warp because it's been done so many times. If you look at something like, let's say, Babylon 5, they ripped the warp whole cloth from Warhammer 40K and just dropped it right into their universe, and I'd like to avoid doing that. So I started thinking about, well, how could I manifest it? And what I settled on was the concept of light and darkness. Genesis and many other religions and a lot of mythology from across the world says the world began in darkness and then a god or gods brought light. So I thought, well, what if there was this primal darkness that existed before everything else? And what if that was a different plane? And what if you could use that to travel more quickly? So I had kind of an idea. I knew I wanted it to involve shadow, but after working with a number of different names, shadow doesn't really work for me. It's just overused. But fortunately, there is a great synonym for shadow. It is the Latin word umbra. And I decided, okay, I'll look into umbra. I like that word a lot. And as I was looking into it, I remembered that there is something called the Umbral Shadow. So this little area that you're seeing right here, this is the Umbral Shadow. It's the part of the night side of Earth, basically, where we're blocking sunlight, and so it's not directly exposed to the sun. And what I decided is that's what's necessary for mages to travel. If they want to enter the umbral depths, if they want to go to this different dimension and travel to another place in space, they can only enter it from the umbral shadow of a planet or from the depths of space where it's dark and there's no direct starlight. So that's how they get in and out. And then I started asking myself, well, how do they get in and out? What does that look like? And I decided that they create a break in reality, a fissure. So it's not a rift, it's not a tear, it's a physical break. It's like if you hit a wall hard enough with a hammer, the cracks would radiate outwards, and that's what we get for a fissure. So it opens up, and the edges of that fissure glow, but on the other side of it is pure darkness. And so a ship will go through this fissure they've created, and then they'll use their star charts of the umbral depths to travel to whatever their location of exit is, their egress. To do this, they have to brave the dangers of the umbral depths. It's dark, there are all sorts of different races and gods and eldritch beings in there. And so what most ships will do is they'll use their charts, they'll plot a course, and they'll go dark. They will turn off everything and hope that they're not noticed by any of the natives of this plane of existence. They'll zip as quickly as possible as they can to their exit, and then they'll go back to normal space. And this opens up so much fun stuff for my system because now you need a mage who has these star charts and the ability to pilot the umbral depths. There's all sorts of stories that can open up if things go wrong in there, or if they lose their charts, or if they're off by, let's say, a couple thousand kilometers. Maybe they come out a light year away from where they intended to come out. So you can see I've created now a different means of travel so that if you're willing to brave the danger, you can get somewhere much more quickly. This means that mages would be in very high demand, but that people would be very careful, especially if you're a kingdom or a nation. You're not going to want to send all of your ships through the umbral space because you're going to lose a lot of them, and doing so could get very expensive. So the umbral depths create the constraints around which I can tell stories in my universe, and you're going to see this when you start looking at the fiction. And I want you to, if possible, think about the same for your universe. How do people travel? And this can apply to fantasy, to science fiction, to any sort of historical fiction. If it's the mid-1800s and you're telling a Western, you might have a telegraph coming through, but by and large, people are bringing word on horseback. So be aware of how distance and the need for communication work in your particular universe. In mine, word is very slow, like Game of Thrones, to get places. It's difficult to get word to another sector, and so people react accordingly. They don't have the instantaneous internet that we're used to today, and that paints a very different style in the setting that ordinarily I would use. So anyway, I hope this information is useful. Next week, we are going to take a look at magic systems and how I created mine. If you have questions in the meantime, please go ahead and post those in the comments or shoot me an email. I would love to answer them. I'm having a lot of fun with the world building, but I am going to go ahead and get back to the writing, guys. I'll see you next week.